Welcome to the 10th lecture for International Regulatory Frameworks for Climate Change and Environmental Management. So yesterday we looked at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and you remember we went through some of the science and then looked at the Framework Convention, particularly the objective of avoiding dangerous climate change, and so considering the policy context of our overall goals. We also talked yesterday a little bit about some of the basic parameters like carbon dioxide equivalence. I'm going to come back to that today when we talk about the Kyoto Protocol, because it's the basic unit for reporting greenhouse emissions. So this is the second of our 3 lectures on climate change, and in the next lecture we'll look at the Paris Agreement. So in this lecture I want to start with a wider issue, the major themes, the framing of public debate on climate change. And I've got a handout for you that I've just given out. I also want to talk about economic lunacy, and then a summary of global action on climate change that really, we can look at the world doing a lot of things now, even within the US. Many states, California, Massachusetts, many states are taking considerable action. So there's diverse action around the world, with obviously some holdouts, the US federal government and some governments dragging their feet considerably, Russia as a prime example. Okay, so the main topic that I want to cover though in this lecture is the Kyoto Protocol, and we're going to look at the 3 flexibility mechanisms that were created under it. Well, first we'll look at the commitments of the Annex II countries. So the rich countries effectively, as at 1992, committed under the Kyoto Protocol to limit their emissions during what was called the first commitment period from 2008 to 2012. So to help them achieve those goals and to help the global community generally, there were 3 flexibility mechanisms built into the Kyoto Protocol. We'll look at those in a little bit of detail, and they're useful to then go on to consider how things have changed under the Paris Agreement. Okay, look at gaps and criticisms of the Kyoto Protocol, lots of critics, and also I want to just mention REDD+, so reduced emissions from avoided deforestation and land degradation, and the plus stands for also taking into account biodiversity benefits of those actions. So the context I won't dwell on, talked about it in our last lecture. So 1990 to the present, all of the major parts of the international environmental regulatory frameworks are in place, and climate change becomes a dominating concern during this period. It stalls though after the Kyoto Protocol, in the Bush years particularly, and we've got the major fallout in 2009 at Copenhagen. Life's only really been breathed back into, like you couldn't think of climate negotiations quite like a corpse, but it pretty well had a heart attack in 2009, was on the ground getting CPR to keep it going, and then in 2015 Barack Obama in China brought the paddles over and went and the corpse goes ah! And so now we've got this life back into the body. It's still very weak though. Okay, so I want to start, and it's really a cross-cutting issue, which is why I want to deal with it now, which is the major themes or the framing of the public debate around climate change. And it comes from a really interesting, I thought it was really interesting. You read a lot of things, and a lot of them just, sort of, nothing really new there. This article by Matthew Nisbet in 2014 really caught my eye, because I think it's really hard to understand why people are, against taking action on climate change if you just look at it logically and look at the science. But what this table does is basically look at multiple dimensions of why people potentially are against against taking action on climate change, and it's not just about the science. So I took his table, and I've given you that as a handout. Do you need a bit more light? I might give you a bit more light to look at that. I took his table and adapted it. Now I would say that I emailed this to him and said, hey, I really liked your article, it spurred some ideas for me, and what do you think of this? And he didn't agree with my approach, which is fine, but nothing he said really dissuaded me from thinking that it was useful for helping me understand and also helping to explain the different themes in the climate debate. So what I do on this table is split between people saying that there is urgent action required, and in the sort of pinky top bits, and that and then the bottom bits in the green, urgent action is not required. And the further you get away from the middle, the more extreme is the position. So, and then going along in the different cells, so urgency is the first column, then we've got group, public problem framing, how they conceptualise the problem, then also their outlook on nature, their outlook on technology, their policy proposals, and their model of social change. So for the first, or the top ones, Nisbet called them ecological activists, but I thought that that was a really pejorative term, so I changed it to new system reformers. And whereas his second group he called smart growth reformers, I call them current system reformers. So basically the second group to me is people that even though they see problems with the current system, they either accept the current system or they don't think that there's a realistic possibility of moving beyond the current system. So I would say straight off that I'm in the current system reformers category. I think we need to work within the current system, including the UNFCCC, the market and capitalism, those sorts of concepts. But let's just look first at the new system reformers. So these are people seeking fundamental change in current society and social consciousness. So the sort of writers that you see are Bill McKibben, the founder of 350.org, fantastic writer, really admire Bill. Clive Hamilton, an Australian ethicist, you could call him a polymath, master of multiple topics, writer of multiple books. George Monbiot in the UK as well, if you follow his writing. He's another extensive writer, So their problem framing is that they say that capitalism, consumerism has exceeded the carrying capacity of the planet, risking catastrophe or certain collapse. I can agree with that, but I also don't see that we can replace capitalism as a driving concept. So I agree with elements of their problem framing, but I don't agree with all of their other ideas. So their outlook on nature is that it's sacred, fragile, it provides for human salvation, must be kept separate, protected against human influence. Their outlook on technology, they advocate small-scale, locally owned renewables, warn that nuclear energy, genetic engineering is too risky. They promote consumption. They call for strong regulation of industry, rationing of energy use, localisation of economies, food systems and governance, and their model of social change is a new consciousness. And I suppose that would be the thing that I would highlight for them. They're saying that there's got to be a fundamental change or we're basically stuffed. So that's new system reformers. They want to take the current system and replace it. So the second group, the current system reformers, so well-known advocates of it, Al Gore, arguing that we need to take urgent action on climate change, sure, but he's working within the existing international frameworks and national governments. Nicholas Stern, the English economist who wrote the Stern Review in 2011, was it? A few years ago now, a leading, it might have been 2007 actually. I'll come to him when we talk about economic lunacy. So Stern, Ban Ki-moon was the UN Secretary General, Christina Figueroa is the previous Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC. So all of these leading international people arguing for certainly rapid action on climate change, but they are staying within the existing system. They're trying to make the existing system work. And they see, in terms of problem framing, climate change is the ultimate market failure, corrected by putting a price on carbon. The progress has been blocked by deniers. So they think that ideas like capitalism and consumerism, those sorts of things, are just too hard to change, and we can still succeed within the current system. So similar sort of ideas to the new system reformers, except when you get through to the model of social change. They use market mechanisms, not a whole of system change is essentially the difference. Okay, and change that to the people who say that the urgent action is not required. And there may still be people that say they accept the science of climate change, but for different reasons they don't think we need to take urgent action. So Nisbet had essentially only had one group there. He called them eco-modernists. And you can see, I just thought his terms were just really pejorative. They were really eco-modernist. Sounds nice, doesn't it? And I don't agree with his labels. I call them techno-optimists or delayers. So people like Roger Pilker Jr., Bjorn Lomborg, the Danish economist, writer, wrote books like The Skeptical Environmentalist, basically argues that the world is getting better and better, and even though there are problems, we've never had it so good, and there's no catastrophe waiting around the corner to punish us. That environmentalists who say there is a major catastrophe coming, they're just essentially henny pennies running around saying the sky's about to fall in. There's no real reason for alarm. So those people basically say that there's a market failure, that nature is more resilient rather than fragile, and they believe in policy proposals of basically research and technology, they don't see urgent action on climate change, and they don't see things like a price on carbon as being necessary. So that's another group. And then the deniers, or what I call fake skeptics. So people like George W. Bush, John Howard, Tony Abbott. Now I'd include in that, Trump. So they don't see there's a problem. They don't see that climate change, anthropogenic climate change is real. They think it's a myth. It's fake news, according to Trump. It's not happening. Their outlook on nature is the same as the delayers. They think that nature's really resilient, it's bountiful, it won't be damaged by us. They also don't advocate for, basically the big other difference with delayers is for policy proposals. They don't propose any policy. No policy response is required. They promote the free market, the anti-regulation, neoliberalist in their outlook. So why I like that is because it's multidimensional, and sure, those groups are fairly coarse, and you might, even the people that I've put within them might argue that should be in a different group, or they mightn't fit every element of them. But as a general framing, I think it's useful. What do you think? I would expect that. I would expect that. Actually, who would see themselves as a new system reformer? it's fine if you do. If you think that the current system is inadequate, needs to fundamentally change, you can. Yep. So we've got one. Who would see themselves as a current system reformer? That the current system, the UNFCCC, for better or worse, we're stuck with it, and we need to make it work as well as we can. So yeah, that's the bulk of us. I won't ask anyone to put their hands up for the other categories. If you do, that's okay. And you might think that my labelling of them is pejorative, but if you don't think that urgent action is required in climate change, that's a perspective that other people hold as well. I don't see it as soundly based, but you make your own minds up essentially. Yep.
The only thing I would maybe change if I think is my table. I don't think that the label like techno-optimist strictly applies to someone who doesn't think there should be urgent action. Because I would say myself, I'm techno-optimism is that I think that renewable energy and something like that is something that's really going to help people.
Yep.
Because I don't think that people will change their ways individually.
Yep.
But I still think there's urgent action on climate change, but more in you need to be using technologies we have to help fix this.
Yeah, okay, great.
I think it can be applied to the other ones as well.
Yeah, I suppose one of those techno-optimists are also, they fundamentally believe in the market. So you could call them also market optimists. They basically believe that human ingenuity will solve all problems. So I call them techno-optimists, and I used in an earlier lecture, I put up a picture of Star Trek and the idea that we will travel to the stars, which I hope one day humanity does, but at this stage we can't do that. And so hoping and being able to do something are different things. So, okay, could change the label. Okay, anyone else would change? And again, it's open to debate. And as I say, Nisbet, the original author, like if I go back to his, you can see he put a number of different people in his three categories. And his article was about public intellectuals and how they frame their arguments for action on climate change or against it. So, and he put down a number. So he didn't agree with what I was proposing. Any other changes? So the basic idea that I'd like you to take from this is that, there are quite fundamentally different views on, in terms of if you only looked at the policy proposals, from people calling for strong action to people calling to no policy response required, the explanation for why they have those policy proposals can be multidimensional, and it might be a fundamental view of how the world works, their views on the market, their views on a range of other things that ultimately lead to the policy proposal, so that the policy proposal isn't just a logical deduction based on a mechanical exercise from the science says this, therefore we should do X. What they believe the facts are then gets filtered through the lens of their own belief system. An idea for you. Can I emphasise that, promote, in terms of, I agree with the promoting, technological optimism to a point. So we should promote and celebrate technology, but I would say don't assume that it will solve all our problems. That's why I wouldn't call myself a techno-optimist. Technological change is going to really help us and has helped with things like dealing with ozone-depleting substances and also with climate change. So this is one of the greatest advances for the world in dealing with climate change, was the invention of LED light or white light. So these three Japanese scientists received the Nobel Prize, American and two Japanese scientists, I think they were all originally Japanese, received the Nobel Prize for, in the 1990s, they created the modern LED light bulbs. So I think, is it blue and red, and what are the three colours you need to make white light? They got them to basically work together so that essentially they could produce white LED light, and it's far more energy efficient than the previous forms of incandescent light bulbs. So that's been a revolution in lighting, and I would suspect that everyone in this room has an LED light in your pocket or your bag. Obviously your phones and computers, pretty well ubiquitous now because they're much more much more efficient. So that's a great technological advance that saved huge amounts of greenhouse emissions. So celebrate those sorts of things. But yeah, we need behavioural change too, is my view. Okay, the second topic I just want to touch on was economic lunacy, because there's a number of major reports that were done about a decade ago. One was this Economics of Climate Change, the Stern Review by Nicholas Stern, and the other was essentially the Australian version by Ross Garnaut. So Stern, this is 2007, his famous finding was that the benefits of strong early action on climate change outweigh the costs. So Stern was a economist, had been with, was it the World Bank, or was a very well-regarded economist. His report is basically like a little, it's a big, thick document. I'm sure people have heard of it, many people have heard of it before. So that was his famous finding, because until his report, there was a strong argument that we can don't deal with it now. We'll be richer in the future and and technology will allow us to deal with it more cheaply in the future. So essentially, delay action. And he turned that on its head and said, basically, early action is actually economically sensible. But even within his report, he accepted the science on. He had a team of scientists advising him, and he accepted the scientific consensus at that point that coral reefs will be extensively and eventually irreversibly damaged by temperature change relative to pre-industrial levels of between 0.5 degree and 2 degrees. And at 2 degree warming, coral reefs are expected to bleach annually in many areas, with most never recovering, affecting tens of millions of people that rely on coral reefs for their livelihood or food supply. Okay, so those are direct quotes from his book and his findings. But he then went on to say that to recommend that global stabilisation goal should lie within the range of 450 to 550 parts per million carbon dioxide equivalent, thereby accepting a likely warming of 2 to 3 degrees and the loss of coral reefs as economically rational. Similarly, Garnaut basically took Stern's model and prepared a report in 2008 for the then new Rudd government in Australia, and basically did the Stern Review equivalent in Australia, and he concluded similarly in relation to coral reefs. This is just taking one aspect of his report, but as we talked about yesterday, a very important aspect, and said if atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations increase beyond 450 parts per million, together with a global temperature rise of 1 degree, a major decline in decline in reef-building corals is expected, and a carbon dioxide concentration of 500 parts per million or beyond, and likely associated temperature change would be catastrophic for the majority of coral reefs across the planet. But then also recommended aiming to stabilise atmospheric greenhouse gases in the range of 450 to 550 parts per million, implicitly accepting the loss of coral reefs across the globe as economically rational. They don't say that. They don't say, we can lose coral reefs and it's economically rational, but it's the only conclusion you can reach from their findings of fact about what will be the damage to coral reefs, and then their recommendations for what is the economically rational target to aim for. So no one comes out and says, hey, we've got this target, and by the way, all coral reefs will be dead. Is that okay? No one says that. They say, we've got this target, and we're hoping that everything will be okay. And we're doing everything we can to protect reefs. And then Australia then adopted Garnaut's report and the recommended range in its negotiations at that stage. So things like the Australia's Low Pollution Future. So this was a report done by the Australian Treasury to as the basis for Australia's approach to an emissions trading scheme under RUD and what its international goals should be, international position. And it said Australia and the world continue to prosper while making emission cuts required to reduce the risks of dangerous climate change. Even ambitious goals of stabilising at 450 parts per million have limited impact on national and global economic growth. Which just, like, they accepted the Ghana report without actually acknowledging what Ghana was saying, that at those levels coral reefs are severely impacted. So, and they're saying, they're basically spinning it. You can't, not even spinning it, they're just basically ignoring the downside of those levels and say that will have limited impact. It's just wrong. So as we talked about in the last lecture, coral reefs are expected. So the best available science says coral reefs at current levels are already being impacted, but if we could hold them at current levels, coral reefs would be generally okay. So current levels are about 1 degree warming. So the image on the left, we've had three global coral bleaching events, one in 98, one in 2002, and one in 2016. So we've had 3 already at current levels of warming. So no one could, if we're already getting it, so even if you stabilise, if you could hold temperature right at this point, you'd expect that we'd still have global coral bleaching events in the future. And your hope would be they won't be too regular, or won't be any more regular than they currently are, and they won't be any more widespread, and coral reefs will not be completely stuffed. But if you go on another half a degree or another whole degree, so we're at 1 degree now, so the target of stabilisation at 2 degrees just seems, we're already having severe impacts. How can anyone think you could go on to 2 degrees and there not be even worse impacts? So 2 degrees image is in the middle and 3 degrees is on the right. So that's what the best science is saying. So Stern, Ghana and the Australian government recommend that we stabilise somewhere between 450 and 550 parts per million. So they're basically saying stabilise somewhere between these two images of the reef. So, I just think it's economic lunacy. I just, when you actually read the reports and you read what they're finding and then what they recommend, and they're saying that that's economically rational. And I thought, how do you conceptualise that? And I think it's choosing to continue to burn fossil fuels, knowing that we'll destroy ecosystems like the Great Barrier Reef, is like concluding that on a cost-benefit basis, it's rational to amputate your arms and legs so that you can keep smoking. Because that's, so if someone walked in here now and said, I'll give you $1 million if, you'll chop off your arms and your legs, on a cost-benefit analysis, would anyone take it? How about if they walked in here and said, I'll give you $1 billion if you chop off your arms and your legs? I might think about that, because you could do a hell of a lot of good with $1 billion. Think of the work. If you think about the. Anyway, I'm not quite joking. If someone, if I was with my 2 kids and someone threatened us with a gun and said, I'm going to shoot them or you, who do you want it to be? Put up my hand. Of course you would. There are things that are worth dying for, or worth having severe impacts for, but they're extreme. Okay, this though is this is just a sort of lazy. We're too lazy to even try to really protect the Great Barrier Reef, and we're going to continue to burn all our fossil fuels, knowing that these impacts are going to happen, and we're not even really going to have a proper debate about it because we gloss over the fact of what are the impacts be of the targets we're setting. So, I call it economic lunacy. Do we have any economists? I've had in previous classes, I've had economists that take offence, say, does anyone think that that's too strong? And feel free to say, Chris, that's, just too much.
I feel like I can understand why there's any ankle to be there, because to be honest, it's probably realistic. It's like absolute crap that we're going to lose coral reefs, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And it's horrific. But I guess rationally, I guess there's not a lot of expectation anymore, or even realistic hope that they'll reach it.
That
and
is
policy,
such a good point, yeah.
Yeah, like, you know, we self-regulate on the recommendations that we'll make in class, but people self-regulate in the real world in what they're going to say. Because if they go too far, people are just going to wave it off and not listen. Whereas if you lower it down a little bit, people will probably going to listen a little bit more.
Yep.
And it sucks, you know, but that's what people do.
Yep. Really good point. Other thoughts?
I think we're using the reef as a proxy for a whole range of other things that are harder to predict.
We are, or I am?
Well, I think generally the ecological arguments, and that makes it difficult for people to comprehend what does that mean for fisheries, what does that mean for the long-term future of the coastline, what are the other impacts that also come with that 450 to 550. I think that focus on that one thing as a proxy, I think is still challenging for people to understand the economic arguments that go with it.
Yeah, and it gets a bit complicated with the economic arguments, because I've seen this economists argue about substitution, and it basically goes like this with coral reefs. Like, so I think Australia earns about, is it $6 billion a year from reef-associated tourism? So if the corals are gone, people still have to go on holiday somewhere. If you've got a pretty island chain, then tourists will still come to go sailing in the Whitsundays, even though there's not reefs. So you've got substitution. They don't necessarily go to look at the reefs, but they go to go sailing. So you actually have a net economic loss of nothing for loss of tourism. So there's substitution arguments.
Except there'll be no marinas when the sea level rises
by
50 centimetres, and it's all those other consequences I think are hard for people to comprehend that go with the loss of the reef and the other thing.
Other comments?
I think in economics it's always easy to value things in terms of their economic value, but things like the Great Barrier Reef have an intrinsic value that can't really be measured or equated to a material sort of.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. So in the Stern report, one of the reasons why other economists criticised him, because Stern was actually seen as a bit of a radical, as all these other economists saying, oh no, it's more rational to wait, and one of the key economic arguments or criticisms of it was the choice about the discount rate, which is a rate that's applied by economists to basically value something that you've got now as opposed to having that same thing in the future. So if you've got $1 million now, it's worth more than $1 million in 20 years' time, because you can put it in the bank and earn interest, so to speak. So the discount rate and the choice is quite a... But that all of that detail just gets completely lost in me, because I just think it's crazy. It's just crazy to think that we can just do things that we know are going to destroy these ecosystems, not just because of their intrinsic value, but because they're so fucking important to us for fisheries, because the Great Barrier Reef for Australia is very important, but the number of countries that depend on fisheries associated with reefs to feed their people. It is absolutely crazy that we wouldn't do everything that we possibly could to, avoid that future. And it may be the point that we can't, get to 2 degrees. But every report that comes out for target setting should say that 2 degrees we think is the best that we can possibly achieve, and at that level we will have these impacts. So there will be no Great Barrier Reef. The Murray-Darling will be reduced essentially to a dry dust bowl because of increased evapotranspiration, basically massively reducing the agricultural output from it. The impacts that we should basically list with our targets. Instead, we just get this glossy waffle, which is really misleading and lulls people into just this false sense of security, because people trust, our leaders fundamentally. I think with John Howard, a lot of people really trusted that if he had thought, that there was really something that needed to be done, we would go and do it. So, we went to the Iraq War. Clearly we went there because, the US, we were just supporting the US, even though it was illegal and they didn't have the weapons, and our own defence agencies were saying they didn't have the weapons. Was it Wilkie, that, the Tasmanian MP? You know his story? So Andrew Wilkie, he's the Tasmanian MP.
Yeah.
So before the invasion of Iraq, with Australia supporting the US, and the US claiming that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, Wilkie, who was basically not a spy, but he was an intelligence analyst with the Australian Defence Force in their highest level office, and basically he went public. So basically broke, he'd been a career army officer and then intelligence officer for 20 years, broke every code of secrecy he'd ever basically signed up to, and went public to say that, our best intelligence says they don't have weapons of mass destruction. They don't have it. And it completely, destroyed the argument that our John Howard had at the time, that they do have weapons of mass destruction. That's what our intelligence is saying. And they never prosecuted Wilkie because it was just too high profile for it. But it was such an act of tremendous courage. We give medals to people that run into the face of a machine gun, but people that have the courage to be whistleblowers, knowing that they'll be shunned by all of their former friends and colleagues, and break. He just took such tremendous courage. So, but most people believed Howard, that there was something there. And because we don't have leaders that say, this is an emergency, we are going to lose the reef unless we do everything we can. In fact, we just continue to sleepwalk into the future, approving minds like Adani. So, economic lunacy. Okay, so in that context, the world is doing a range of things, inadequate, but we are still taking action. So I'd emphasise, many years ago, back in 2000, when did Inconvenient Truth come out? It was 2005, I think. So that was Al Gore's movie, An Inconvenient Truth. And I think the sequel's just come out, or coming out, isn't it? So Gore, in 2005, it was a grim world for climate policy. There was the Bush, the Iraq war was still going on, the total emphasis was on terrorism. John Howard was, still very strong politically. There was no action in Australia. And Inconvenient Truth came out, and I went to see it. I just thought it was fantastic. I was in this theatre packed with ordinary people, seeing this amazing documentary about the problem. And I thought, this is fantastic. And then after Gore produced his film, he was on a radio show, and they asked him, what are you going to do now? And he said, I'm going to train, on the spur of the moment, he said, I'm going to train 1,000 presenters to go out and present my slideshow, or my presentation, because his documentary was actually just about a slideshow like I'm presenting here. And in fact, I actually get all the colour scheme. Some people don't like the black and white and red, but it's actually Gore's colour scheme, because when he said he'd train 1,000 people, they advertised it in Australia as well, and I put my hand up for it and went down for the first training they were called, I think they were climate presenters, and there were amazing people in that. There was Kate Blanchard and all these famous people. I was just like a nobody, and there was is it Cat Empire? Do you go? There's a and Cat Empire, the lead singer from that. He must have been really good. Felix, yeah, he must have been really good looking, because I remember being at the first drinks and there were all these people, all these ladies fluttering around Felix, and I didn't even know who he was. But anyway, there were all these great people, and Gore basically trained us to go out and present his slideshow. And so I really liked his approach and learned a lot from it. And yeah, I liked the black on white. But and I picked up a lot of things from Gore, but he is famous for saying there's no silver buckshot to climate change. There's no silver bullet, but we've got silver buckshot. So buckshot is an American term. So but that idea that there's no silver bullet, the term that is used in policy speak, though, is a portfolio of responses. We've got many things that we can do. There's no one answer. So, and seeing it as an economic opportunity is really important. So, these are just some quotes from the Chinese premier at the time. We shouldn't pursue economic growth at the expense of the environment. Such growth won't satisfy the people. The Chinese government attaches great importance to addressing the climate change issues. And basically seeing it as an economic opportunity. So around the world, this is even back in 2012, so prior to the Paris Agreement, and you can't read those, but all around the world there was a whole range, and has been for over the last decade particularly, a range of renewable energy targets, carbon prices, energy efficiency and transport vehicle performance standards and action. So just a lot of action around the world. Obviously the standout things that you see are the wind farms being built, big solar panels. I really like renewable energy stations. So does anyone read Renewable Economy? It's a really good website. They have one post a day. It's really often very positive, and it's essentially about the renewable economy, and highly worth looking at. They basically talk about all the different things. So you can go on, I wonder if this will work for me. So here you can choose, let's just say a renewable energy target, and go and look at, say, Canada and what it's doing around the world. Let's look at Congo. Where will it go from there? And basically in Uganda, the renewable energy target, 61% of electricity by 2017. Current share of renewable electricity is 71% in 2012. So basically allows you to move around the world and see different targets, emissions targets, renewable energy targets, prices, emission standards, energy efficiency, forest and farming emissions. So huge portfolio that the world is essentially pursuing. And all of these things now is essentially what the global community is now wrapped up into making their own nationally determined contributions for what they will do. Those contributions didn't come out of thin air. They were based on what the countries were already doing, what they thought they could achieve in the future, without damaging their economic growth. So lots of things happening. Here's another. So the nationally determined contributions of different parties. You can also, there's a whole range of really great interactive maps. So let's ignore Australia. How about we look at South Africa? So Paris target, peak plateau decline greenhouse emissions by 2030. Total emissions in 2012 was 450.6 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalents. Emissions per capita, and then essentially you can drill down into the different countries for what their, it's gone out somewhere there. So a whole range of really good interactive maps that really help you build up a picture of what's going on around the world. A lot of developing countries also have many clean energy policies. So one click on that one. The links are all in the slides if you want to go and have a play and look at different energy policies and opportunities around the world. Heaps going on. And there's many good action websites on climate action as well. So the Climate Council is an Australian-based one. I really like Renewable Economy. There's heaps of them. Climate News, heaps. There's been the Climate Council in Australia does really good snapshots of action around the world. So this was one they just put out just before the last, not the COP this year, but the COP before. So really good summaries, basically saying around the world there's a whole range of measures that are being taken. Even with that though, our current, with no action, we're still on a trajectory that's really bad. With our current nationally determined contributions, we're heading for 3.5 degrees by 2100, and to get to 2 degrees is going to require a lot more action than we're currently doing, and particularly phasing out fossil fuels. To have any chance of getting to 2 degrees, we've basically got to leave most fossil fuels have got to stay in the ground. And one of the huge problems that we've got with current policies is no country that has fossil fuels is actually committing to do that. No one. Australia doesn't, the US doesn't, no one that has fossil fuels is saying they will leave them in the ground, because under our international reporting frameworks, emissions count for where they occur, but if you dig up fuel and you sell it to another country, the emissions count on their books. So there's effectively no restraint on the source of fossil fuels. So many countries are taking action to address climate change, and the range of measures are not simply the flexibility mechanisms. I want to just clarify that before we start talking about CDM and emissions trading and those sorts of things. There's a whole range of things that are going on. So the UNFCCC establishes the broad framework, but the detail was left to be worked out to later protocols. So the 196 parties to the UNFCCC touched on them yesterday. So what's the time, by the way? Is it 9:55? Before we jump into this, do you want to take a break and have a cup of coffee? Go and find the coffee machine, and why don't we press pause here, take a break, get up, stretch, and we'll jump into looking at the different groups again, and then go on to the flexibility mechanisms. So welcome back from our short break. Just before we had a break, we were starting to look at the Kyoto Protocol, and we just mentioned the UNFCCC, and that there's 196 parties to the UNFCCC. Yesterday I mentioned the different annexes, and I just wanted to recap on that before we then go into the Kyoto Protocol. So there's the Annex 1 and Annex 2 parties were the basically rich countries plus the former USSR countries. So 1992, when this was signed, so the Soviet Union had just broken up, and so basically the countries in blue were part of the Soviet Union, and when they split up, there was still a lot of, there was a huge loss of pride for the countries in the USSR when, it all just went bad. So in 1992, it's sort of a face-saving thing. They were called economies in transition, and they were included in Annex 1. They're included in Annex 1, but not in Annex 2 of the UNFCCC. And then everyone else who wasn't in an annex are called non-annex parties. So, and I also covered this in the last lecture, just to recap really quickly. So, Annex 1, 43 parties, including the EU. It's the industrialised developed countries like Australia, the US, Canada, all of the European countries, plus 14 economies in transition, the former centrally planned Soviet economies. Annex 2 is essentially just all the rich countries who are actually required to give financial and technical support to the economies in transition and developing countries. So those 24 parties, are essentially supposed to pay the others and help them. And then the non-Annex 1 parties is 153 others at that stage, in terms of number of countries. So China was a non-Annex 1 party, so they're not actually listed, but they're non-Annex 1 by default. And then Annex B will come to under the Kyoto Protocol. So essentially, these are countries that accepted binding commitments under the Kyoto Protocol. And there's also another group, the least developed countries. So the Kyoto Protocol, again, you can get it on the UNFCCC website. It was signed by the US. So Al Gore was the vice president to Bill Clinton at the time. And the talks, the story goes, the talks had stalled. Al Gore flew in and really pulled it out of the, basically pulled out a deal at the last minute. And the US signed the Kyoto Protocol. So that's Bill Clinton actually signing NAFTA, so the North American Free Trade Agreement, not the Kyoto Protocol, but get the idea. So the executive government can sign, but then under the US system, they have to be ratified. Remember the stages we talked about? You've got the signature, and then it has to be ratified in accordance with the procedures in the country. So in the US system, a treaty that imposes legally binding obligations has to be ratified by the US Senate. So 100 senators, there has to be a 2/3 majority. So the US Senate voted 95-0 against ratifying the Kyoto Protocol. When it was signed, Senator Larry Craig, a Republican from Idaho, head of the Republican Policy Committee, told reporters that it is, quote, designed to give some nations a free ride. It is designed to raise energy prices in the United States, and it is designed to perpetuate a new UN bureaucracy to manage global resource allocation. Craig described the signing the protocol as, quote, the first time in history that an American president has allowed foreign interests to control and limit the growth of the US economy. So not even Democrats voted for it. So there was a bitter story at that time of Australia's undermining of the Kyoto Protocol. So Australia went, and Robert Hill was the minister at the time, and Australia insisted on special treatment, and the global community, Europe particularly, was desperate to get an agreement. So they basically agreed to basically Australia's unreasonable demands, and particularly the what's called the Australia Clause in the Kyoto Protocol. In accounting for greenhouse emissions, countries are allowed to account for emissions from land use change, because it just so happened the baseline that they were going to use for the Kyoto Protocol, Australia had high rates of land clearing at the time. So by including those emissions, it meant that Australia had a high baseline, and effectively meant that our commitments, because we had controlled land clearing sense, could be met quite easily. So yeah, Australia did a lot of undermining of the Kyoto Protocol. And this was remember Clive Hamilton, I mentioned him earlier, an Australian ethicist. There's a good story, you can follow it if you want. There's a link in the slides. Basically he talks about Australia's negotiation tactics at the Kyoto Protocol, and how just terrible and unethical. Well, Australia just basically acted in what it saw its self-interest, and it didn't, under Howard, it didn't see climate change as being, it saw it as being a phony problem, and so you didn't want to have any impact on the economy, and basically that was the approach taken. But at the same time, they didn't want to just be seen, because the global community was all wanting to sign up to this, they didn't want to be seen as the outlier, so they signed it, but they just basically white-handed it before signing it. So you can get the Kyoto Protocol in a whole range of different languages. So if English isn't your native language, I'd highly recommend going and having a look at some international agreements in your native language. So obviously Chinese, Russian, all the UN languages, and some more. So is that Persian at the top? So Arabic? Persian? Persian. Is it Farsi? Okay, so that's the the top one is? Yep, so
That's the Arabic.
that's Arabic, the top one. Okay. So it's in Arabic isn't one of the. Well, actually, we've got all this whole range of languages, and I simply say go and have a look at it in if and the whole premise of these treaties is that each version of the text is equally authoritative. So they're meant to be essentially mean exactly the same in the different languages they're written in. So in a summary of the Kyoto Protocol, it did two things. First, it created binding commitments for emissions reductions for Annex 1 countries during 2008 to 2012. And it created 3 flexibility mechanisms. I think that should be Annex 2 countries. We'll get to that in the text. Created 3 flexibility mechanisms: joint implementation, clean development mechanism, and emissions trading. So there's other mechanisms are not referred to. These aren't the be-all and end-all of climate policy. They're just 3 mechanisms in the Kyoto Protocol. So Kyoto Protocol standard sort of structure. Article 1, definitions. So convention refers back to the Framework Convention. So it's very similar to what we saw with the Montreal Protocol to the Vienna Convention. Remember that you get references back to the main convention. It even refers there to the Montreal Protocol because a lot of ozone depleting substances are also strong greenhouse gases. And the Montreal Protocol has actually been one of the biggest successes the international community has, not only for ozone depleting substances, but also in addressing climate change. So by avoiding or reducing emissions of those chemicals, we've also reduced greenhouse emissions. And so party included in Annex 1 means a party included in Annex 1 to the Convention, or a party that has made a notification under the Article 4. So I'd like to just open up the UNFCCC and Kyoto Protocol. So I did open up the UNFCCC yesterday. So I'm not going to be able to read that. So it's 25 pages long. And we've got our preamble that we looked at yesterday, definitions, and then the objective that we focused on that yesterday. And remember, I pointed out the annexes at the end. Which lists countries like Australia, and then Annex 2. So when we look at the Kyoto Protocol, what language would you like it in? I'm fluent in all of these. Let's do it in Mandarin. So the Kyoto Protocol to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, 1997. There you go. 1998 there too. Anyway, you've got enough. I've given you enough there, hey? There we go. See, I was right. So the Kyoto Protocol, Article 2, each party included in Annex 1. So remember the definitions. Annex 1 means Annex 1 to the Convention. Each party included in Annex 1 in achieving its quantified emissions limitation and reduction commitments under Article 3 in order to promote sustainable development shall implement, etc. And then Article 3, the parties included in Annex 1 shall individually or jointly, ensure that their aggregate anthropogenic carbon dioxide equivalent emissions of the greenhouse gases listed in Annex A do not exceed their assigned amounts calculated pursuant to their quantified emissions limitation and reduction commitments inscribed in Annex B and in accordance with the provisions of this article, with a view to reducing their overall emissions of such gases by at least 5% below 1990 levels in the commitment period 2008 to 2012. So there's the commitment period. Seen as the first commitment period, so this is signed in 1997, and they've got a commitment period for 2008 to 2012. So let's just go to the annexes. Annex A lists what are called the Kyoto gases. So you've got carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and then there's two classes of gases, so hydrofluorocarbons and perfluorocarbons. Actually, there's lots of gases in those classes. And then sulfur hexafluoride, which I mentioned yesterday, the SF6, that's used in high voltage electrical systems and the like. So they're the six, they're called six gases, but as I say, two of them are classes, so there's actually a lot more than six. And the sectors, and then Annex B. So these are the quantified emission limitation or reduction commitment, percentage of base year or period. So for Australia, Australia's commitment is to limit its emissions during 2008 to 2012 to 108% of its emissions in 1990. Does that make sense? I see a few quizzical looks, but essentially, based on what Article 3 said, that's the effect. So most countries you see there actually have a reduction over their base year. Australia, as I said, basically held the world to ransom, negotiated not only for a net increase, but it also included emissions from land use change. And that, yeah, apart from anything, they're really difficult often to quantify. So there's a lot of fuzziness about those numbers as opposed to how much fossil fuels you've burnt. You can calculate how much your emissions from fossil fuels is quite precisely. So yeah, so that's the first commitment period. So why do you think, let's think about the mechanics of this. Why do you think they chose 1990 as the baseline? So that it's being signed in 1997? Is it just because it's a nice round number? Yep.
Is it similar to what we were talking about the other day? Like they didn't have a chance to up their emissions and then make that their baseline in 1997.
So yeah, you wouldn't want to make it 1998, would you, the baseline? Because then, or say 2000, if you said based on your 2000 emissions you will limit to 108, because then there would be an incentive to go in and burn a lot in 2000 and up your baseline. So basically it's by going to a previous year, at least to the extent that you can calculate the emissions that occurred then, and there can be a lot of problems with verifying what emissions actually occurred then. But to the extent you assume that you can get a number with reasonable integrity, then it can't, you can't basically cook the books, so to speak, by increasing your emissions in that year to artificially inflate your baseline. And it's also reasonably recent in that it's, you're not setting a baseline of 1960. By 1990 is reasonably recent for the negotiations happening in 1997. And why do they have the commitment period? Like, why did they choose the commitment period of 2008 to 2012? Sorry? Yep, they've got a chance to find alternatives. But like, how far out is it? Is it like
It's 10 years.
10 years in the future from when they're signing it? So they've got it's not like 50 years in the future. So why didn't they set a commitment period for like 1940 to 2040 to 2050? Why not set it 50 years in the future?
Because they really wouldn't have had to take much action in the time before that.
Yep. So it's close enough, like it's far enough away that you've got time to do something. But it's not so far away that effectively you get to party on for ages. See, it's, you're talking about changing or limiting your economy in some way or finding new technologies. It's a big deal. You need time to do that. At the same time, you don't want it to be so far out that it, you don't have to take any action for ages. So it's a sort of Goldilocks for their problem. You're trying to find it not too far out, not too close. And the 4 years, is a bit artificial and arbitrary, but they didn't want to have it forever. So it's a commitment period to give them something to aim at. And Kyoto was always seen as a first step. It was never seen as, the ultimate answer. It was seen as an important first step or stepping stone towards effective action. So a lot of people criticise Kyoto, and sure, you can criticise it, but it was as good as they could do at the time in the negotiations, and there was a lot of countries like Australia that actually white-handed it, and then with the US it didn't even ratify it anyway, so they just walked away. So that's so Annex 1 of the UNFCCC, not the Kyoto Protocol, includes those countries, including, I got that wrong before, the Annex 1 countries do include all of the economies in transition as well. So they, but they didn't necessarily have to make a... Annex 1 countries means Annex 1 to the UNFCCC, I think is a simple message. Then Article 3 links Annex 1 countries to commitments in Annex B of the Kyoto Protocol, and has the commitment period of 2008 to 2012. And also I'd mention in Article 3, paragraph 7, in the first quantified emission limitation and reduction commitment period from 2008 to 2012, the assigned amount for each party included in Annex 1 should be equal to the percentage inscribed for it in Annex B of the aggregate anthropogenic carbon dioxide equivalent emissions of the greenhouse gases listed in Annex A in 1990, or the base year period determined in accordance with paragraph 5 above multiplied by 5. These parties included in Annex 1 for whom land use change in forestry constituted a net source of greenhouse gas emissions in 1990 shall include in their 1990 emissions base year or period the aggregate anthropogenic carbon dioxide equivalent emissions by sources minus removals by sink in 1990 from land use change for the purpose of calculating their assigned amount. So the land use change component was brought in by Australia. The multiplying by 5 is because the commitment period ran for 5 years, 2008, 9, 10, 11, 12. So that's why you multiply it by 5. So it's the net amount, your emissions. So if you're a little bit high in 1 year, as long as you come down in the next year, so that overall in that 5 years, you've maintained it at average at what your commitment is. Does that make sense? And notice we're using the term carbon dioxide equivalents, which we talked about yesterday. So that's bringing together all the different gases. And so these gases listed in Annex A, as I said, 2 of them are classes of gases, not individual gases. And these are the countries listed in Annex B, and including the Russian Federation. So it did include those economies in transition. They did have commitments as well. Most Europe, so Europe led the way. And you can really think of, I was thinking of it this morning, if you think of the 3 main players in climate action now, who would you think are the 3 main players? So who are the big players, do you think?
China.
China?
US?
US? Really the European Union, because the European Union negotiates as a bloc, and they essentially have a unified foreign policy, and they have been the consistent leaders for climate action. So, it matters that, the UK is breaking away, and, the refugee crisis is that, and the fact that Europe, a number of countries have been on the brink of bankruptcy. It really matters for climate action because Europe is, the leading international player. And then I suppose also another player, if you think of groups, is AOSIS, so the small island states that are going to be drowned by climate change. They're the ones that have really pushed for the 1.5 degree target. They're the ones supported, with the support of Europe, that are pushing for stronger action. So obviously they're not very economically powerful, but they've certainly been a really vocal voice in climate negotiations. Article 5 of the Kyoto Protocol says each party included in Annex 1 shall have in place no later than 1 year prior to the start of the first commitment period a national system for the estimation of anthropogenic emissions by sources and removals by sinks of all greenhouse gases not controlled by the Montreal Protocol. Guidelines for such national systems, which shall incorporate the methodology specified in paragraph 2 below, shall be decided upon by the Conference of the Parties, serving as a meeting of the parties to this protocol at the first session. So effectively, that's the national reporting systems, and I'm going to show you Australia's as an illustration shortly. But basically, there's an international framework for reporting under the Kyoto Protocol. A key thing about it is you basically look at sources from the individual countries, so emissions, but as I said before, that if you are a fossil fuel exporter, the export, like Australia's export of coal, don't actually show up on our books under the Kyoto Protocol. So when we export, Queensland exports about 230 million tonnes of coal a year, which equates to about 500 million tonnes of CO2 when it's burnt. So when you take a tonne of coal and burn it, you end up with between 2.1 and 2.8 times the amount of carbon dioxide if it's black coal. So if we have 230 million tonnes exported by Queensland each year, when you burn that and it goes into the atmosphere, that's about 500 million tonnes. That's equivalent of Australia's national emissions of greenhouse gases under the Kyoto Protocol, but it doesn't show up on our books. So a significant sort of accounting trick for countries like Australia that export fossil fuels. So I'll come back to that in a moment. Well, I'll go to it now. Carbon accounting under the UNFCCC then and Kyoto Protocol. Let's have a look at that. So the IPCC established a task force for national greenhouse gas inventories. You can go and find that on their website. And just as an example of that, so there's this international system, and then Australia has enacted legislation to fulfil its obligations for reporting, and we passed the National Greenhouse Energy Reporting Act in 2007 under John Howard. It requires basically large emitters of greenhouse gases to report their emissions, but it doesn't impose any price. It's also the cornerstone of any future regulation, because in Australia, even though we don't have a price on carbon now, when we did, this was essentially the price on carbon mechanism was piggybacking on this legislation, because if you can't count it, you can't regulate it, you can't put a price on it. So this is a really important piece of future regulation of climate change. Yeah, a critical part of any future regulatory response to climate change is how we account for greenhouse emissions. The National Greenhouse Energy Reporting Act is significant in that sense. And you can find information about it on the Clean Energy Regulator. It's the statutory regulator. Just do a search for NGR Act if you're interested. So the greenhouse gases required to be reported under the ENGIE Act are the same as under the Kyoto Protocol. So, and I've just given you a couple of examples there of hydrofluorocarbons. So fluoroform, HFC 23, has a global warming potential of 14,800 over 100 years. So it's 14,800 times more powerful a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. And an example of a perfluorocarbon is carbon tetrafluoride. CF4 has a global warming potential over 100 years of 6,500 times carbon dioxide, and there's heaps of those gases, different types of them. So yeah, it's not just 6. So it's really hard to visualize because gases really hard. The volume of gas, as you know, changes with pressure and temperature. But at standard temperature and pressure, a tonne of pure carbon dioxide would basically be 8.12 metres cubed. So, about as, I reckon it'd be about as big as this. We might, I think it's hard to visualise, but how many of those cubes do you think we could fit in this room? 8 metres. So we're going to look at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So it's probably, wouldn't be much more than between 1 and 2, do you think, of those cubes? So basically, let's just say that this room, if it was pure carbon dioxide, we'd all be dead, but which wouldn't be, let's not go there. But you're only looking at like 1.5 tonnes of carbon dioxide if it was basically pure CO2. If it was pure carbon dioxide and we were still alive, we couldn't actually see it, you couldn't smell it, so CO2 is odourless, colourless, invisible to us. Here's another visualisation of a tonne of CO2 at standard temperature and pressure. So really difficult to visualise, but also really difficult to measure if you try and do it like at the once it's burnt. So the way that we basically work it out, generally, when you burn fossil fuels, you look at the quantity that has been burnt, and then just basically multiply the quantity by a few numbers to give you the amount of gas that would be produced. So the ENGIE Act framework is built around scopes 1, 2 and 3. People come across these before? It's a basic framework that's widely used for reporting. It came from an international approach for reporting emissions from companies that wanted to basically look at their own emission profiles. So scope 1 emissions, does anyone know what scope 1 is? Direct emissions? Yep, from what? So describe it. What does direct mean?
That you're producing it on the site.
Yep, so you're actually producing the greenhouse gas. So if we had a little, so say if you, does everyone have a car? Okay, so when you turn on the key and you're burning petroleum, there's some carbon dioxide coming out your tailpipe. So you have scope 1 emissions from your activity of driving the car because you are actually burning it. A coal-fired power generator has scope 1 emissions, direct emissions from them. Scope 2 emissions, does anyone know what that is?
Indirect emissions.
Indirect emissions, okay. So indirect in the sense that it's...
Emissions that you're buying off the grid from somewhere else.
Yeah, so it's emissions, indirect emissions due to your use of electricity. So in this room, we're using electricity, we've got lights on, we're running a computer, we've got air conditioning. So we're using electricity. We're not actually burning coal here or anything here to generate it. So we've got scope 2 emissions associated with our activity. What's the rider on that? Because in UQ, has anyone been up on the roof and seen the massive solar arrays in UQ? Really great fun if you get a chance to go up and have a look at them. Up on a number of the buildings there's these huge solar arrays. So particularly at a time like today when there's not a lot of activity on campus, we would be producing a large chunk of our own power from solar. So how do you think you account for that if you are trying to work out, say, our emissions from this lecture? Let's just say, how do we know if it's coming from the solar or if it's coming from the normal grid, which is mostly coal?
We must still meter the incoming from the normal grid. Sure, there's two separate metering processes, an in and potentially an out.
It could get really complicated if you tried to get down to that level of detail. For your individual activities, generally you report they use just basically percentages of a grid that is, solar or something. So you just basically incorporate the normal percentage. You wouldn't normally go down to the level of, for an individual activity like this, you wouldn't normally try and separate out the solar component. It'd be too complicated. But essentially, in a grid, there's a known, percentage of power that's coming from solar. So if you're at home, then, and you're using electricity and you wanted to work out your Scope 2 emissions, you could basically just work it out from published guidelines under this legislation, which are based on average sort of emissions across the grid in Queensland. Okay, so that's Scope 2 emissions anyway. So that's indirect emissions from electricity use, and then Scope 3 emissions. Anyone except you? Anyone else? What are Scope 3 emissions? So we've got direct, we've got indirect from electricity usage. Scope 3 is okay, so it's indirect emissions. Again, anything else that is either upstream or downstream of your activity, which you might want to incorporate. So there's a lot of flexibility with Scope 3 emissions. So, for instance, in our, the computer that I'm using, there's embedded emissions in it. In our clothes, there's embedded emissions. If you came on, say, who came by bus today? Okay, so to get here, there were some emissions associated with your travel, which you didn't actually generate. They were generated by the council. But you effectively, to undertake your activity, you had the benefit of them. So you could account for your emissions in getting here as Scope 3 emissions. And so often companies account for things like taxis and air travel as well, which they don't actually, it's not their direct emissions, it's not Scope 2 emissions, but you can incorporate them as Scope 3 emissions. Similarly, for a coal mine, they typically have Scope 1 emissions from digging up the coal, all of the machinery they're using and fugitive emissions as they dig it up. They might also be using electricity from the grid for the big drag lines. They're massive users of electricity, so they can have Scope 1 and 2 emissions. And the Scope 3 emissions that with a big coal mine, the standout ones are in the coal. So if a company like Adani sells coal to another company in, say, India, the Adani in Australia doesn't account for the emissions as Scope 1 or 2, but you're selling a fossil fuel which you know is going to be burned. You could regard them as Scope 3 emissions, so of Adani's coal mine. So Scope 1, 2 and 3 might sound a bit weird, but it's actually a useful framework to think about the different ways in which an activity might generate greenhouse gases or contribute to the generation of greenhouse gases. So let's just try and solidify that with just a quick case study. So calculating greenhouse gas emissions from an actual activity, a power station. So Swanbank Power Station is located about 30 kilometres southwest of here. I used to run field trips out there for one of my other courses. Interesting place, been there several times. So if we're looking down on it, here's Swanbank. And here's a picture looking across the lake. Swanbank B power station is shown there. It was a coal-fired power generator. It closed in about 2012, basically because it became uneconomic to run it. So they've closed it. And here's another image a little bit further back. So Swanbank B is in the distance. So over there, that's Swanbank B. That was a coal-fired power generator. Swanbank E is in the foreground. It's a gas-fired generator, and these are the cooling towers for Swanbank E, and these are the cooling towers for Swanbank B. So the cooling towers is just basically where you're cooling down the water that goes through that you're using to generate steam. Where is the carbon dioxide? Can anyone point it out? Or where's the funnels for carbon dioxide? So here for the gas-fired power generator, and these are the two for the coal-fired generator. So when they burn the coal over there, it goes up in those flumes. They have they had some big devices to try and pull out the particulates. So they had license conditions about not allowing them to emit really lots of pollution, but they didn't have any limits on CO2 because that's just essentially the waste product of burning the coal. Okay, so Swanbank, you can calculate the emissions. You could go to, under the National Greenhouse and Energy Reporting Act, there's a factors, a National Greenhouse Accounting Factors Workbook, which is a sort of simplified system for voluntary reporting particularly. The actual system for reporting is really quite complicated, and you would have to look at for a large coal-fired generator, you'd actually look at the amount of carbon that was in the coal you were using, and you would have to do basically scientific tests on it to work out the actual carbon rather than just using standardised numbers. But if we just use standardised numbers, which is sort of the average of coal in a given area, so in Queensland, we've got figures for average sort of carbon content of coal. So the key point is that for a known amount of fuel, you can calculate the amount of greenhouse gas emissions from burning it, and the basic formula is this: the emissions equal the quantity by the EC by EF divided by 1,000 for units, where EC is the energy content factor in gigajoules per tonne, EF is the emissions factor in kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per gigajoule. So you can get those for averages just from a table, and if you were actually doing this in practice, typically you just go to a greenhouse accounting calculator where it would have all of these things. Would basically be, if you were burning a particular type of fuel, you knew your quantity, it would do the calculation for you. So you see there, if we're burning black coal, so anthracite is the closest fuel combusted here. So it's not brown coal we're burning, which is largely water. It's not coking coal, which is for steel production. Anthracite's probably the closest description for thermal coal burnt at Swanbank. So the EC is 29. And then there's an EF for the amount of carbon dioxide that's produced, methane and nitrous oxide. Now notice that there's the emissions factor for carbon dioxide is 88.2, and then for methane and nitrous oxide are very small, because basically when you burn coal, you pretty well just get carbon dioxide. You get virtually or very little methane and very little nitrous oxide, so that's why their numbers are so small. So it's not, see how I've got, it's 88.2 plus 0.03 plus and 0.2. Now mathematically, you shouldn't just add them up, you should do the calculation separately, but can we just fudge it a little bit and just add them all together to get 88.43 as our EF, rather than, you're supposed to, according to the formula, you're supposed to do each one individually and then add them at the end. I just added them just so that we could have it in the one number, or we could just go 88.2 and just ignore the methane and nitrous oxide, but so it's not quite right. But the sort of figures that Swanbank used to burn in terms of coal each year, from one of their annual reports I drew out a figure of 813 and 162 tonnes of coal that year. So if you multiply that by 29, by 88.43, divided by 1,000, you come up with a figure of 2,085,329.6 tonnes. So 2 million tonnes of CO2. Does that make sense? So even though it's hard to visualize what 2 million tonnes of CO2 actually looks like, we can, because of it, like if you're a power generator, you know how much coal you've used. You've had to pay for it. You know, it's something that you've got good records of. So you can calculate your emissions quite easily because you know the amount of fuel you used. You can calculate your emissions. So in terms of reporting, for this sort of operator, it's relatively easy. And gas, similar sort of formula. Emissions by the quantity of the fuel by the EC and EF. In a standard year, the Swanbank E would generate about 793,000 tonnes of CO2. So the takeaway message from that is that implementing international environmental regulations at a domestic level can be very complex. Okay, so a bit of mathematics there, but that's only just this. If you actually go and look at the National Greenhouse and Energy Reporting Act and the regulations, it's these complicated calculus symbols, and particularly where you get into like something like a power station is relatively easy, but there's also reporting for things like rubbish dumps and a whole range of other activities, sewage treatment plants, anything that produces greenhouse gases over a certain quantity requires reporting. And then there's all these different approaches for calculating. It's really complicated. Has anyone worked in that area? So there is a lot of work, or a substantial amount of work for environmental managers in carbon accounting. It was getting really big when the carbon price came in. There were a lot of our graduates sort of working in that area, and then when it all folded, basically all of those divisions just got shut down in the environmental consultancies, and lots of companies just basically let all those employees go or redistributed them. So it was becoming a really big area of employment of our graduates. And not so big now, but it's still going to be the cornerstone of future regulation. So it can be difficult and complex and require a lot of supporting administration. But for most companies, you know what fuel you've used. If you're a trucking company, you know how much fuel you've used because you've had to pay for it. Or you know how much electricity you've used because you've had to pay for it. So that's the basic approach for calculating emissions. Okay, so that's calculating emissions. Can we go on to flexibility mechanisms? We're going for time. Does anyone want to take a break, or shall we push on with flexibility mechanisms? How about I hand around some more? Okay, so under the Kyoto Protocol, the Annex 1 countries have these commitments that they have to meet between 2008 and 2012. The Kyoto Protocol created 3 flexibility mechanisms to help them achieve that, and also to help developing countries who didn't actually have commitments but help them to reduce their emissions as well. So the 3 flexibility mechanisms under the Kyoto Protocol are known as JI, or Joint Implementation, CDM, Clean Development Mechanism, and also emissions trading. The first 2 are the ones that are fleshed out the most. So joint implementation is in Article 6. For the purpose of meeting its commitment under Article 3, any party included in Annex 1 may transfer or acquire from any other such party emission reduction units resulting from projects aimed at reducing anthropogenic emissions by sources or enhancing anthropogenic removal by sinks of greenhouse gases in any sector of the economy, provided that any such project has the approval of the parties involved, etc. So who's it between? It's between any party included in Annex 1 and any other such party. So 2 Annex 1 parties. So Australia and Canada might have a JI project. So there might be emissions reductions in Canada that Australia might claim credit for. But you can see how that's not really such a big deal. Hey, you've got 2 rich countries basically sharing or reducing emissions together. The big one is CDM. The purpose of CDM shall be to assist parties not included in Annex 1 in achieving sustainable development and in contributing to the ultimate objective of the Convention, and to assist parties included in Annex 1 in achieving compliance with their quantified emission limitation and reduction commitments under Article 3. And so basically, CDM involves a rich country, an Annex 1 country, paying for a project in a developing country, and then the emission reductions in the developing country can be counted by the rich country for their emissions reductions. So Germany, for instance, might fund a project in China, and that project, let's just say it reduces, let's just say it saves 1 tonne of greenhouse gas emissions. So that 1 tonne can be credited to Germany's emissions reductions, even though the emissions reductions occurred in China.
Also counted by China?
Sorry?
Is it also counted by China?
Is it also counted by China?
Yeah.
Because China has no commitments to reduce their emissions, it doesn't matter. So it might still be reported by China, but this is about flexibility to help the developing countries meet their commitments, and it's also basically to provide an incentive for funding projects in developing countries. So it's a bit of a reciprocal arrangement where, the rich countries aren't just giving money to a developing country. They are getting something back. They're getting a credit, which they can then apply to their emissions reductions. So CDM. So there's a large amount of technical detail and records of CDM projects available on the CDM website. So just got there the cover of the CDM methodology booklet. Complicated little area. There's a whole range of positive examples of CDM. So this was just from a UNEP Momentum for Change Climate Heroes documentary. I won't go there, but basically it was in this little clip, the workers in China are talking about how they used to they were harvesting the wheat chaff. So once you've harvested the wheat, you're left with the stalks. So they also then went out and harvested the stalks and took them to a nearby power generator that burnt them for electricity, and it was being claimed as emissions reductions. So they were using basically vegetation to generate electricity and claiming it as a CDM project. There's been a huge amount of criticism of CDM projects for rorts. Basically projects that had already, like the famous ones are in Indian dams that had already been built. Because one of the key things with CDM was that it was supposed to actually be additional to what would have happened otherwise. You couldn't just get a CDM credit for something that was going to happen anyway. So these dams had already been built. So they're your epitome of something that not only would have happened anyway, but had already happened. And then they just got some money for nothing, basically. So huge amount of criticism. And this is just a cover page from an article in Nature in 2011.
Is that a whole lot different to Australia claiming all the land use change?
Yeah, like Australia. Yeah, it isn't different to Australia with its. We got this agreement. The other countries did. So
we're more transparent.
I'm not sure that we're more transparent. I'm not trying to, here am I the irony, I'm trying to defend Australia. No, I'm not trying to defend Australia. It is different in nature. This is basically outright, there was a lot of fraud in CDM. There's a lot of criticism of it. And it highlights one of the real difficulties of this whole area is verifying emission reductions.
They can only claim it once, right? So they cheated once, and now they're going to have to actually do something.
They can only claim it once. Well, I think I told you the story about the Chinese company that manufactured I think it was a perfluorocarbon, or like a really high potent greenhouse gas. They manufactured it just so that they could then claim CDM credits for destroying it. So they actually had this little rort going. So can you only claim it once? Well, maybe they could destroy it and then remake it, I'm not sure. So yeah, a lot of criticisms of CDM. And a lot of them went to China. So if you think about it, so this is 1997 was agreed, and then the commitment period was 2008 to 2012. Huge amount of development in China through that period. So a lot of, say, German companies or US, not so much US because it wasn't a party to Kyoto, but certainly European countries. If you're going to move your plant to China, you might be also able to generate some credits with, what so there was a lot of investment going on in China anyway. And so a lot of CDM credits were in China, about 46% of total CDM projects. Big chunk, 21% in India, and then you see other countries a smaller amount. And what were generated were called CERs. Basically the market collapsed for CER, so certified emissions reductions. There was a price for them, like companies would generate them according to the CDM methodology and then sell them. You didn't have to have a one-on-one relationship as a company. You could buy them on an exchange. You could buy CERs, and basically around 2012 the price just collapsed. So this is when it currency fell to a record low of just 0.52 euros, fallen 90% in a little over a year, and it's effectively going to fall to zero. Apart from CDM, there's also been a lot of criticisms of joint implementation. So this was a really interesting report by the Stockholm Environment Institute a few years ago. This study systematically evaluates the environmental integrity of joint implementation in the first commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol. I also brought this in because I was really interested in it as an evaluation. It's a really good evaluation, like what you guys are doing for your research projects. So systematically evaluates the environmental integrity. Our analysis indicates that about 3/4 of JI offsets are unlikely to represent additional emissions reductions. This suggests that the use of JI offsets may have enabled global greenhouse emissions to be about 600 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent higher than they would have been if countries had met their emissions domestically. And this is their executive summary. The joint implementation is one of two offsetting mechanisms under the Kyoto Protocol, along with CDM. It enables countries with emissions reduction commitments under the protocol to generate emission reduction units, or ERUs, from greenhouse gas reduction projects and transfer them to other countries. As of March 2015, almost 872 million ERUs had been issued under JI, about 1/3 of all Kyoto offset credits. They evaluated and found that basically there was a lot of So I like this also because just to show it to you, it's a really interesting way of visually representing what they found. the plausibility of the additionality claims of the sample projects. So did they actually result in emission reductions that wouldn't have happened except for the funding, is what additionality asks. And so they're saying that for a big chunk of them, the number of projects in the ERUs issued, for the ERUs issued, about 73% were not plausible, that they actually were additional to what would have happened anyway. So that's a big, big chunk, isn't it? And then this is just, again, another table showing the different project types. So spontaneous ignition of coal waste piles, registered projects 78, 26% of ERUs, and yeah, they just basically found it wasn't plausible that they were actually additional. So yeah, the ERUs collapsed. Price just, collapsed around 2012. So leading on then to emissions trading. So there's very little detail about emissions trading in the Kyoto Protocol. It was seen as, a mechanism for flexibility, but there wasn't a lot of detail because essentially it was, it had been a mechanism that had been used in North America and a bit in Europe for dealing with sulfur dioxide emissions, so trading between different emitters. And so emissions trading had come from that sphere, and it was seen as potentially useful for reducing emissions using a market and in the most efficient way, so that companies could trade emissions reductions, and you essentially allow the market to deal with things efficiently. So Article 17 basically sets up emissions trading, but then leaves it to be worked out at later meetings. And the most famous emissions trading scheme was EU's. So it was set up back in 2003, I think was the first version of it. And now, does anyone know other famous emission trading schemes? EU's is most famous. Australia's is infamous as the first one to have been introduced and then repealed. China now has a large emissions trading scheme as well. So EU's system, I won't go into the details, just looking at the prices, probably the most interesting. So you see there from 2008, price collapsing down and then being stable through 2010, 2011, and then just eroding down to basically from a peak of about 30 euros back in July 2008 down to less than 5 euros per tonne. So basically price volatility was huge, and the price collapsed in it. Do you know why? What's the fundamental reason why the EU emissions trading scheme suffered, or basically has been pretty well worthless in putting a price on carbon? It's built around how it's created and how the EU operates, because the EU has got many member states, and the ones that have got heavily polluting industries, they gave the ability to give out basically free permits. They allowed the states to allocate, and so the big emitters over allocated basically free permits under it, and so it's just basically being rorted by states that have large emitting industries. So, and the EU's just had great difficulty trying to rein that in. So this is from a few years ago, price dropping to basically just about zero. And a lot of critics of the EU ETS, people that support it basically just say, well, we've learnt a lot. I reckon you can only say that for so long though. Yes, we have learned a lot from it, but we've learnt what not to do. So it's been there, it hasn't been really effective in reducing emissions. It still hasn't been, it doesn't have an effective or significant price on emissions. So the whole idea is you price emissions and then, potentially drive other sources to take over, put a price on, say, coal-fired power generation emissions, then it makes it easier for, say, solar or wind to compete, or batteries. The price hasn't been very significant. This is from an article last year. The main problem with the European carbon market has been and remains a crippling surplus and massive giveaway of free pollution rights. The cause is an institutional inability to correct market failure and respond to changing circumstances in a timely way. In essence, a too little, too late response. The EU, though, has been, it was groundbreaking for the EU to try and do it. They've also been trying to apply the EU ETS to international flights, and that's been just so... I don't quite understand why it's been so attacked by the US and China, but both of them argued very, very strongly that the EU shouldn't apply the requirement for emissions to be paid for international flights from their own countries. So there were disputes, went to the European Court of Justice, and this is just an article about how the US tried to shield US airlines. They basically were trying to say, they tried to pass a law saying it would be unlawful for a US airline to pay the European price for emissions, which is just crazy. I mean, there's an obvious logical reason for the EU to, impose a price on flights coming into the EU. It wasn't that they were trying to impose a price on flights in the US. So there was a clear link or nexus to them from an international perspective. But anyway, the US Congress was up in arms about it. And there's been ongoing attempts to basically regulate emissions from airlines and shipping as well. The International Civil Aviation Organization, this is just a news item about them pushing ahead with it. So there's some big emissions trading schemes. China now has a really big one. The European Union, this map showed, this was from 2013, so Australia, which then got rid of it. But you can see a number of countries around the world, Japan. In the US, a number of the states have an emissions trading scheme going, but obviously it's not a national scheme. So multiple emissions trading schemes around the world. And this is just another map, current or proposed. So the idea might be, you might think one day there might be an international emissions trading system. But when you look at the problems that there have been in Europe, it just seems implausible that we could ever have a system that, there wasn't just a whole heap of free giveaways and a system that just basically collapsed under its own, internal inconsistencies and internal over-allocation of individual countries. But it's a widespread mechanism. As I said, China launched a few years ago. It started in Shenzhen, and then basically it trialled it at a small level, and then it's broadened it out. So criticisms of the Kyoto Protocol, lots. That it's failed. This is just one of them. Although politicians have put all their efforts into Kyoto, and Europe has overwhelmingly invested in current renewables partly as a result, the prize has been ignored. It would be better if the focus shifted to what really matters, pricing carbon consumption, getting out of coal as fast as possible and investing heavily in future renewables and new energy technologies. Little, if any, of this will be achieved through the Kyoto approach. At each COP, now well-established process of green groups and environmental ministers gathering together to make declarations of intent without much concrete action is played out. And it went through a stage where the US under Obama was, it looked very grim for a long time. James Hansen, I mentioned him yesterday. He's this, one of the world's greatest climate scientists. And he had a proposal, not been adopted anywhere, but his idea was a global carbon fee in which fossil fuels are taxed when they're produced or imported rather than when they're consumed. And so countries would collect a fee when fossil fuels are mined or imported and distribute the revenue to their citizens while charging extra border duties to countries without a similar scheme. So there's different proposals for what you might do apart from emissions trading. The gap, though, that I think in terms of criticisms of the Kyoto Protocol, the elephant in the room is mining and energy policies. As I said, there's nothing in Kyoto to regulate a country like Australia selling coal or developing our oil and gas. And our energy policies are basically built around developing all of our oil and gas. So, we've got a hell of a lot. We've got well over 100 years of coal at current rates of production, huge amount of gas, coal seam gas, enormous quantities. And basically our current proposal is to basically dig it all up and burn it all. So this was I call it believing in the tooth fairy. The tooth fairy policy, climate policy. Does that have a nice ring to it? Who can come up with a better tooth fairy and climate policy? Climate fairy, tooth policy? The climate fairy. Believing in the climate fairy. How about that? Which basically is we can dig up and burn all our coal and we'll still have a livable climate. We'll still have a Great Barrier Reef. It just doesn't make any sense. But this is just a graph from an energy white paper from when the Rudd government was there, but it's the same under the current government. So this is showing Australian coal projections and consumption, production and net exports. So the red bars are for production, the green bars are for net exports of coal. So basically it starts in 2009 and goes through to 2035. So basically Australia thinks, and the plan only went to 2035, that's why it doesn't just stop magically at 2035. So our plan is to basically continue to increase our exports of coal, basically until it's all used up. And similarly for gas, this is from the same plan for our gas production going from 2009 out to 2035. So the red bars are production and the green are net exports. So basically increasing production out until it's all used up. And Australia's emissions reduction, it's a bit fuzzy that, isn't it? But essentially that shows Australia's emissions at being about 600 million tonnes of CO2, so direct emissions. And so going out to 2050, so when Labor, for instance, talks about a 80% reduction by 2050, they basically mean this. All the coloured bars going up are, so the plus 82% at the top here is emissions that business as usual. And these are they're proposing to reduce those, but how they get down to 80% is to offset it with international credits. So effectively what Labor's policy is to keep Australia's direct emissions the same out to 2050, so no net increase, and then we get to an 80% reduction by essentially buying an 80% reduction from, so we buy credits from, so similar to CDM. So when Labor talks about Australia will have an 80% reduction in our emissions by 2050, they don't actually mean we will actually be 80% less than we're currently producing. They mean, I know that that's fuzzy, but basically their plan is we'll keep our emissions constant in 2050 and we will basically buy credits, international credits, to have a net reduction of 80%. Does that make sense? So, I won't worry about the descriptions of them. So just a couple more things about this. So energy breakthroughs are hard won. Commercial fusion reactors were just a few decades away in the 1970s. Now the running joke is that they're still 40 years away and always will be. we cannot rely on technological solutions arriving just in time. We have to have behavioural change now. Just want to mention before wrapping up this lecture, and we might. It's only 11:15, but we'll have a nice long break for morning tea. Hey? Just want to mention RED and RED Plus. So this from about 2007 through to 2015, when everything looked really bleak for climate policy, a lot of the negotiations were around trying to have some things that countries could agree on. And reduced emissions from deforestation and land degradation was an area where there was broad agreement. We couldn't agree on how to reduce our fossil fuel consumption, but we could agree on cutting down less trees or saving trees in developing countries. So RED Plus has been really popular for the last decade. So you can find heaps on it on the UN RED program website. It's about basically reducing countries paying to reduce emissions in developing countries by paying for improvements in avoided deforestation and avoided land degradation. A lot of criticisms of it again. And this is an interesting article from a UQ writer, Kristen Lyons. She came and spoke at this lecture and this course a couple of years ago and talked about her paper here, because what her work focused on was, so she looked at a Swedish energy company that was growing trees in Uganda, and the impact that had on the local peoples. And what she found was that essentially the Ugandan government effectively forced the locals off their land, so people that were actually using the land for farming and the like were basically forced out for forestry projects that were then used to generate credits under the RED program. So, and you can see in the title, Carbon Colonization, Carbon Colonialism and the New Land Grab, Plantation Forestry in Uganda and its Livelihood Impacts. And she wrote about that these projects, they might look good on paper, and you think, who wouldn't want to avoid land degradation in a developing country? But when they're actually implemented, they can have really significant impacts on local livelihoods, and the profits don't necessarily go to helping the people in those countries, or the poor people. So her project looked at Uganda raises some really concerning issues about RED and RED Plus. And I suppose the message that I would take from that is, and the criticisms of CDM is, when you actually look at things, the reality of them being implemented, they're often really messy, and there's often real difficulties with it. CDM has been rorted extensively, same with joint implementation. It's actually really hard to try and regulate these huge activities going on, ensure that they've got integrity, and ensure also that they don't have secondary negative or unintended consequences, like local people being pushed off their land to make way for a plantation. This is a really interesting project. I've said that no country is not proposing to develop all its fossil fuels. Well, one exception, a brief exception, was the Ucini ITT project. I wonder if this will run for me.
The Yasuni National Park, located in the Ecuadorian Amazon rainforest, is an exceptionally unique biodiversity refuge. 1 hectare in Yasuni contains more species of trees and bushes than all of North America. To two isolated indigenous tribes, the Takaeri and Kadominani, inhabit, together with the Waurani, the Yasuni National Park. Yasuni ITT, an initiative to change history. Ecuador has proposed to the world an innovative plan in order to confront the challenge posed by climate change to the future of mankind. Ecuador proposes to leave beneath the Yasuni National Park the 846 million barrels of oil that are within the ITT block. By doing so, the emission into the atmosphere of 407 million metric tons of carbon that would have been released by the burning of those fossil fuels are avoided. In exchange, Ecuador requests that the international community assume its responsibility by contributing no less than half of the revenues that would be received by selling these oil reserves. Direct benefits of this initiative: the non-emission into the atmosphere of 407 million tons of CO2 and the guaranteed non-exploitation of these petroleum reserves. The conservation of the immense biological richness within the Yasuni National Park, declared by UNESCO as a biosphere reserve, along with the conservation of 39 additional national parks, adding up to the most biologically diverse reserve on the planet. Respect for the cultures of the indigenous tribes who live in isolation within the boundaries of the Yasuni National Park. Reforestation of 1 million hectares. A decisive impulse to the country's transition from an extractive economy based on petroleum exploitation towards a more sustainable development model, with broad use of renewable energy sources, respect for biodiversity, and increased social equity. The Yasuni ITT Fund, the CGY's Certificates of Guarantee Yasuni ITT. The Certificate of Guarantee Yasuni ITT will become a financial instrument issued to the initiative's contributors and donors by the Ecuadorian state. It will serve as a guarantee that all the oil reserves that are now underground will remain there permanently.
I might just pause there. So you get the idea. So what Ecuador is proposing. So they're proposing to leave this oil in the ground and protect this area if the world basically gives them half of what the revenue that they would have earned from developing it. So this video is actually from a few years ago. How well do you think they went? Not very well. No. And the whole project folded effectively. Germany was prepared to put in a little bit, but pretty well they got no interest. So the idea, it's a really interesting project, and it highlights the dilemma of developing countries, or a country with fossil fuel reserves, because there is no CDM, even there's no payment that you can get under CDM for not developing your fossil fuels. You don't get payment for leaving coal in the ground. You don't get anything for it. You don't even get any recognition under the, that's an initiative that, has carbon, climate benefits under the existing framework. They were proposing a funding mechanism whereby they get paid to leave the oil in the ground, and essentially the global community basically had little interest in it. So it's a huge dilemma now. Ecuador, Colombia, all the Venezuela, the countries that have significant, so developing countries that have significant oil and gas and coal. Basically their choice is develop them and get the money, and the emissions don't even show up in their books anyway, or they get no benefit maintaining the biodiversity and those sorts of things, and the land and the lessening the impacts on their own peoples, but there's no money in not developing them. So it's this tremendous flaw in the entire carbon, international carbon or climate regime. Is it's just glaring. So even a rich country like Australia, we're proposing to dig up and burn all our coal. How could, we obviously can't say to, a developing country, don't do that, when we're doing it. We're one of the richest countries in the world, and we're not prepared to leave it in the ground. So I don't know what the answer to this is, but it's clear that the current regime is, just got massive flaws in it. So yeah, that was UCUNY ITT. It was an amazing project when it was up, but so yeah, that was in 2012. In 2013, the initiative was officially closed due to a lack of international commitment. Almost 4 years of international negotiations, the initiative was only able to secure 11 million in donations. Yeah, there's ongoing issues. UCUNY is just an amazing hotspot for biodiversity, and also conflict between the development and the indigenous peoples of the area. So and this is just an article from a couple of years ago about the UCUNY ITT initiative. Basically saying, look, it was innovative, and there's great promise for the future, but there's just no interest for it internationally. So, in this lecture, started with major themes, framing of the public debate, talked about economic lunacy, broad brush approach to the global action that's ongoing. There's many different things that we're doing. Looked at the Kyoto Protocol, the emission reduction commitments by Annex 1 countries, a little bit about carbon accounting and the basic point that you can work out emissions of fossil fuels by the amount that's been burnt, and then the flexibility mechanisms under it and criticism of them, and RED+. So in summary, the Kyoto Protocol was created under the UNFCCC to give more detailed commitments, particularly for developed countries or Annex 1 countries. The first commitment period, 2008 to 2012, has passed. There's now a second commitment period that's been established, but it doesn't really, it's got 3 flexibility mechanisms to help countries move forward, and there have been heavy criticisms of all of them, but particularly CDM. And implementing all of this is really complicated. When you start to look at carbon accounting, it gets really hard to verify. So heaps of information on their websites. Cool. Okay, so that's a lecture on the Kyoto Protocol.